Welcome to today's WNBA Author Talk. My name is Julie Frey. I'm a member of the Women's National Book Association's Greater Philadelphia chapter, and I serve as the WNBA's Communications and Events Chair. We're so excited to celebrate Women's History Month today with Lauren Marino. Lauren's most recent book, Bookish Broads, was released last month, and it is a delightful look at some of the well-known and some of the virtually unknown women writers in history. A published author, Lauren has written two other books, Jackie and Cassini, which explores the relationship between Jackie Kennedy and the designer Oleg Cassini, and What Would Dolly Do, which is a fun glimpse into the words and life of Dolly Parton. She has also ghostwritten multiple books. An accomplished editor, Lauren is currently executive editor at Hachette Books. Prior to this position, Lauren was vice president and editorial director of Gotham Books, where she was the founding editor in 2001, and she has served at several other publishing houses throughout her career. A quick note, if you're joining us on Zoom, feel free to write any questions you have in the Q&A. We'll be checking them throughout our talk, and there will be time at the end for audience questions. Welcome, Lauren. Thank you so much for being here.
Hi, thank you. It's great to be here, and I appreciate everyone who is here. I have been a bookworm since as soon as I learned how to read, probably before I learned how to read. And I am really lucky that I've been able to spend my entire professional career devoting my life to books, to writing books, publishing books, editing books, promoting books. And I made a decision early on in my career that I was going to publish strictly nonfiction. And as it turns out, as a writer, what I've been focusing on is writing nonfiction. And I always wanted to keep fiction as in my heart. Fiction, I didn't want fiction to ever feel like work. And in writing this book, was really able to combine my love of fiction with my ability to write nonfiction. I got to combine those two. And I had an incredible time. It was such a luxury in a way to be able to spend a year researching and writing about all of my favorite writers growing up, whether it was Frances Hodgson Burnett or Laura Ingalls Wilder, Jane Eyre and Charlotte Bronte. I got to delve even deeper into that book. Judy Blume, and some of my more current loves like Chimamanda Ngozi Adichie, who wrote We Should All Be Feminists. So I really I went down the rabbit hole of research, and I got the opportunity to look at, to explore some of each of these women's written works, whether some of it was fiction, some of it was essays, and it was an incredible education. It was like getting a PhD in women's literary history, and I could have kept writing forever. I just had a great time. And it was a passion project for me. And as as the National, the Women's Book Association, you are all, I think, kindred spirits, and that you love books, you love writing. So I'm with the right crowd doing this. So I'm gonna just do a quick little presentation to provide some context. And then after that, Julie and I will talk a little, and we can go a little bit deeper with some questions. So I'm going to share my screen here. Let's see, let's make sure that I can. Okay, so before we dive in, I'm going to start with a quiz. First, who is the world's first novelist? Who is the first author to become a billionaire strictly from their writing? Whose books became the impetus behind the creation of the Environmental Protection Agency and the first to cry out the warning of climate change? Which author has sold more books in history outside of the Bible? And who beat out William Faulkner's Absalom, Absalom for the Pulitzer Prize for Literature? So the world's first novelist was Murasaki Shikibu, also known as Lady Murasaki, who wrote The Tale of Genji in 10th century Japan. She wrote it in Japanese at a time when Chinese was the language of government and of business and of men, and Japanese was just the language of women, but it wasn't actually written down. So in Tale of Genji, she took Japanese and turned it into, she took women's language and turned it into what became at that time a huge bestseller and could be argued to be the world's first soap opera on the page. The Tale of Genji is 1,300 pages. It's made up of 54 chapters. It has over 400 characters, and it follows the adventures of Prince Genji, the shining prince who was a vain Don Juan, whose high birth allowed him to have many wives and many concubines. And I sort of look at this book today as a rival if we had The Crown meets Bridgerton. And I know when I was studying literature in school, I was taught that Samuel Richardson invented the novel. No, in fact, a woman invented the novel many centuries before Samuel Richardson. J.K. Rowling is the first author that became a billionaire strictly through her writing. When her marriage ended in a very difficult divorce, she packed her suitcase with 3 chapters of what would eventually become the first Harry Potter book. She had a newborn. She moved to Scotland and was living on welfare and would go to cafes with her newborn. And while the baby napped, she would sit there with a notebook and write. And she is now, she's a little controversial now, but at the time, she felt like she had been such a failure, and she went on to become one of the most wealthy, successful female writers in the history of the world. And she's also been credited with reviving, single-handedly reviving books, the children's publishing industry, which was dying before then, and bringing young adult fiction really into the mainstream. So 60 years before Al Gore's An Inconvenient Truth hit the bestseller lists, writer, marine biologist, and ecologist Rachel Carson was addressing the dangerous half-truths of the chemical industry and poor government policy, which she wrote about in her groundbreaking book, Silent Spring. And she wrote about the dangers of pesticides, particularly DDT. She spoke in front of Congress, when Kennedy was president. And as a result of that, the Environmental Protection Agency was created. And Agatha Christie's novels have sold more than 1 billion copies in the English language and 1 billion copies internationally in translation. She's history's best-selling novelist. Even though J.K. Rowling is the wealthiest, I think that's because she was invested in the films, but I think it was also inflation. She has only been outsold by the Bible and Shakespeare. Her novels have been translated into more than 100 languages. She has written 66 crime novels, 6 other novels that were romances, 24 plays, and more than 150 short stories. So she was incredibly prolific and is still beloved and read today. And Margaret Mitchell, who wrote Gone with the Wind, beat out Absalom, and William Faulkner for the Pulitzer Prize for the novel in 1937. It took her 10 years to write the book, and she sold the film rights to Gone with the Wind for $50,000, which at the time was a groundbreaking amount of money for film rights. The movie went on to win Academy Awards. And as far as we know, she never wrote or published another book, which is somewhat tragic. So all of those women I just talked about were extremely influential. And as Margaret Atwood says, a word after a word after a word is power. And women who write are exercising their power, even in the times, societies, and cultures where they had very little power in other parts of their lives. And my interpretation is that having a voice, finding your voice, sharing your voice, expressing it, and being heard and having influence is the very embodiment of power. So female writers have been doing that since the beginning of history. And that power is often expressed in speaking of, up until the time that they were writing, unspeakable taboos surrounding the female experience. Maya Angelou wrote about sexual abuse and horrific racism in I Know Why the Caged Bird Sings. Virginia Woolf explored mental illness and the inner lives of women at a time when stream of consciousness was a new literary device. And I love her quote here. He said, "It's all in your head." And I said, "So is everything." But he didn't get it. We've all been we've all been told it's all in our heads, haven't we? Sylvia Plath wrote about the frustrations of domestic life, ambivalence towards motherhood and suicide. Jane Austen satirized the financial motivations behind marriage and women's dependence on the institution. Jeanette Winterson wrote the first mainstream lesbian novel and was, very criticized for it. She's still criticized today. And she wrote a memoir called Why Be Happy When You Could Be Normal, which is a direct quote from her mother when her mother threw her out of the house when she was 15 for having a relationship with another girl. Her mother said, she said, "Mom, I just want to be happy." And she said, "Why be happy when you could be normal?" So she really broke new ground in that area of fiction. And Judy Blume, of course, who I'm sure many of us read when we were adolescents, wrote about the emotional and physical changes and how to deal with them, in growing up in adolescence. It goes without saying that throughout history, female writers had many obstacles to overcome, not the least being access to education. They also didn't have access to books. In many cases, the women that we know today as writers, they either joined the convent, and became nuns, women who were nuns were the first women to read in the Western world. And it also, they avoided marriage and childbirth, which was such a dangerous thing to get involved in. And they wrote about, African-American women in the United States in particular. It was illegal for them to learn how to read or write. So the obstacles were access to education, marriage, childbirth, being ostracized, and having it even be illegal for a woman to express herself on the page. So this is a list here. This is just a very partial list of banned books. We know that there is a gender bias in censorship, and when women are writing about experiences that are specific to women, and if you're familiar with these books, you know what some of those things are, they have been banned. But each of these women were basically addressing what they saw as flaws in society during the time that they were writing and the inequities that women had to deal with. One of the big inequities was that women could not get published under their own name for most of history. And even to this day, some women still write under a pseudonym. So as Virginia Woolf said, for most of history, anonymous was a woman. Women would be criticized, they'd be personally attacked, their books were banned. And I'm just going to give you a quick little selection of some of the writers who had to write anonymously or under a male pseudonym. The first one being Jane Austen, who had her brother help her find a publisher. And she couldn't use her name, and she didn't want to ruin her reputation by using her name, but it was important to her for readers to know that a woman had written the book. And so she said, "By a lady." Amantine Lucille Aurora Dupin used to dress up in a top hat and men's tales to sneak into all of the literary societies and find out what was going on in the intellectual world, because women were not allowed. And she ended up really becoming a groundbreaking writer under the pseudonym George Sand. Marianne Evans wrote under the name George Eliot, and she got amazing reviews for her first books and became all the rage, and her books were selling and she was making money, but no one realized that she was a woman. And when she finally came out, so to speak, people were outraged. How dare a woman write? How dare a woman publish? But she was very brave, and the reviews were already there in print, so nobody could take that away from her. And she went on to continue to write and be successful and write some of the most beloved books in the English language. Of course, there are the Bronte sisters, who had to first, they were told they could not publish unless they wrote under pseudonyms. So their first collection was poems by Kerr, Ellis, and Acton Bell. And Emily and Charlotte ended up writing two of the most beloved and enduring novels of all time, Wuthering Heights and Jane Eyre. And Louisa May Alcott first started writing books under the name A.M. Bernard. She actually had a few pseudonyms. And when she wrote Little Women, she put her actual name on it, and it became her best-selling and most enduring book. And Nell Harper Lee used a pseudonym for, she just knocked the Nell off of her name, because she didn't want Yankees to call her Nell Lee, but also she thought that writing under the name Harper, people wouldn't know if she was a man or a woman, and I think it worked for her. My daughter was just finished reading that book in 8th grade last week. And even more recently, J.K. Rowling, whose real name is Joanne Rowling, was told by her American and British publisher that she could not publish the Harry Potter books under the name Joanne. So she used her initials instead, because the conventional wisdom was that girls will read books by boys, but boys will not read books that were written by women. And unfortunately, that cultural prejudice still exists. One of the things that inspired me to write this book was that I read an American Library Association article where they had done this huge survey looking at the books in the books that were circulated the most at libraries all over the world. And I was going through that list, and there were only 14 out of the top 100 books that were written by women. And having been in the publishing industry as long as I have been, I know that 70 to 80% of books are purchased by women. And yet, as of 2 years ago, the ALA, their list of what was circulated the most was 14% by women. So I started diving into the research there, and I found this list called greatestbooks.org, where they curate from 129 top, very credible lists of best-selling books and of widely circulated books, or what is considered the best books throughout history. And that includes the New York Times, the New York Review of Books, the London Review of Books, 129 lists. And when they pulled it all together, 17 out of 100 are by women, but Virginia Woolf and Jane Austen are in there twice. So it's really only 14 female writers out of 100. And that list is there online. If you looked up greatestbooks.org right now, it's still that way. And yet women are writing and reading and buying books more than ever. And the obstacles that women have had to overcome have been tremendous, but they have been passionate. And I really look at the things that I learned in writing this book as nothing short of a history of the female experience, because each book that women were, whatever a woman was writing about in her time were the concerns of women at that time. And I was doing a talk a couple of weeks ago, and one of the women in the group said she remembered when the New York Times book review had one page that was a separate page strictly to review books by women. And that was, so we're looking at like in the past 30 to 40 years. And there's all sorts of research there that shows how women get paid less to write books, they get reviewed less, that the reviewers at all of the top literary magazines and newspapers are still mostly men. So that's why I wrote this book. I wanted to celebrate these women. I wanted to understand why they became writers, what they had to overcome, what their main themes and ideas were, and really bring readers to their work so that they are not forgotten. Some of them are just now starting to be taught. I have my English professor from college. I talked to him 2 years ago, and he's now the head of the English department. And he said, you know, I hate to say it, but it looks like we're going to have to teach a course on Jane Austen. And I was like, really? Jane Austen is just the beginning, barely the beginning. So with that, that's just the context to sort of as a jumping off point to talk some more about women writers and to answer whatever questions you may have.
That was wonderful. Thank you. I'm just going to jump on the point you just made about the Jane Austen seminar, or I should say the Jane Austen class.
Yes.
I chose to take a Jane Austen seminar my senior year of college. And the only boys except for one were only in that class because all of the other guy classes had been filled up. So because they procrastinated, they went to Jane Austen and loved it. Hearing them like at the end of the class when they were sitting there, like their hats on, like slouched, not paying attention to the brilliant professor we had. And then seeing them actually engaging through the class. It's like, yes, when the stigma is gone, when the bias is gone, men can enjoy books by women. This is a fact.
That's right. Well, I know in over the summer for summer reading, my daughter read The Outsiders, which I read also at that age. And we watched the movie. And, Essie Hinton was Susan Hinton.
Right.
It was a woman who wrote The Outsiders, even though the majority of the characters are in it are boys. And even more, she wrote it when she was 17 years old, which is incredible. And she was from Tulsa, and she was writing about sort of the people from the wrong side of the tracks and the class clashes that were going on in her own hometown. So, 1967, that book was published, and it wasn't Susan Hinton, it was S.E. Hinton, and they're still reading it in schools, but I don't think that they teach that it's a woman.
Yeah. So. Oh, that's so frustrating. This is why we need books like yours, because they give people who aren't familiar with the fantastic works by women a place to jump off and start to learn and you've given them a reading list already, which is a great gift that you've given readers. So thank you for that.
Sure. I mean, some of these writers are just now being discovered, or they're just starting to be appreciated. Octavia Butler, I was not that familiar with her because I'm not a big science fiction or fantasy reader. But as I was studying her, and then I read The Parable of the Sower, and I just was blown away by her. And the way that she started writing was that she was a teenager, and there was a movie on TV back when there were 3 channels, which I remember. And it was like some cheesy male-oriented, like, crazed women from Mars or women from outer space. And it was like this overly sexualized, where the man's the hero and there's all these sexy female Martians. And she just shook her head and said, I can write a better story than this. And that's when she started writing. And she was dyslexic, and she did not have a strong education. Her mother her father shined shoes, and her mother was a housekeeper, and she just over time educated herself. And I now work for one of my sister imprints at Hachette, publishes Octavia, and The Parable of the Sower this past summer hit the New York Times bestseller list for the first time. Unfortunately, she is no longer alive to see that accomplishment. But then when the Mars rover went into space last week or 2 weeks ago, they have a space station, like the landing station on Mars. They named it after Octavia Butler, which is fantastic.
Great.
Yeah.
So great. So many female voices have been lost over the years. And you mentioned that at the beginning of your book, that their works were either destroyed or misplaced. They just didn't survive time, or maybe they were never recorded at all. With books like yours, like I said, that give the jumping off point. We have a way that, and we have the lists, like you mentioned the list, but the list don't include all the women, like you said. But why do you think that it's important for people to read those books that were written 50 years ago, 100 years ago, 500 years ago? Why are those stories still important?
Well, I think you need to put the human experience into context and understand where progress was made and who was coming up with the ideas that were creating that progress. Mary Wollstonecraft wrote, she was quite the rebel in her time, but and ostracized horribly. Her reputation was destroyed for many reasons, but one of them, she believed in the importance of education for girls. And she wrote a treatise on why do we have to just teach girls needlepoint? Let's teach them how to read. They can be bigger contributors to society if they can, if they can read, if they can join the economy, if they're educated, they'll be better partners, they'll be better mothers, they'll be better workers. And that was back around the time of the French Revolution, and sort of like post-Enlightenment. And, it informs where we are today. And we see how we are still fighting for something as basic as education for girls in parts of the world. Malala has shown us that there are cultures where it's not considered important. So I think knowing where ideas started and where they came from and the context in which, they were happening, and then how they evolve over time, because people can kind of get stuck and say it's like they have like all or nothing attitudes about things right now. And I think it's important to know where things came from and how they evolved and how ideas change and evolve as times change.
And which ones don't.
Right. So like my daughter just read To Kill a Mockingbird in school, and the teacher read a passage out loud in the classroom. And there was a word in there, a couple of words in there that are very offensive. And the kids were outraged. And they called out the teacher and said, "How dare you use this word in our classroom?" And I explained to my daughter, I said, you have to understand that it wasn't the teacher and it wasn't Harper Lee. What she was doing is trying to show that there was a time not that long ago when that word was used, and it was used freely to keep people down and to oppress people, and to feed prejudice. And to be aware of it is to feel the pain of it, right? They are so horrified. So they feel the pain of that word. And I think it creates empathy. It creates understanding. To me, one of the things that fiction does is it creates empathy. Mm-hmm. And it also lets you come out of your own worldview or your own life experience and come to understand the experiences and challenges of people who may not be like you. And that only can create better understanding. You know, I don't think you can just erase the past. You have to
No,
say
learn from
this,
it.
you have to learn from it. That's exactly right. Yeah.
Um, I love that so many of the women you profiled do show that female empowerment, even in an age, and I mean, we're still in an age when it's a male dominated world, but especially back when there were no books that were written by women with their author's name on the cover, or if they were like part of the like the Minerva Press, where it was like hysterical women get saved by men, and you know, um, do you think that the women that you profiled, especially those that have been around for over 100 years, do you think that the reason that their works are still not just important from a cultural aspect, but from a female empowerment aspect is because that we are still fighting?
Possibly. I mean, I think the books stand on their own. You know, they just are great books. You know, I read Jane Eyre. I want to say I was like 10 or 12 years old when I first read it. I can't quite remember, but you know, why does Jane Eyre still speak to young women today? You know, there's something, even though we can't relate to the story exactly, you know, perfectly, or the oppression, but we relate to her. You know,
Yeah.
the reader relates to her, uh, despite being so different from her, and is encouraged by her strength. You know, she's solid, even though she's a poor orphan. She will not compromise herself, and she stands up for herself, and she has integrity. And in that way, she serves as a role model of sorts. And it's kind of, it boggles the mind to think of Charlotte Bronte locked in that house with her sisters and her, you know, opioid addicted brother and elderly father and all the tragedy they've lived, like how she came up with that story. And it was based on her own experiences. So, you know, I think that when you have to learn the craft, you have to learn how to be a writer, but I think some people are just born with this soul of a writer or the heart of a writer, and they really feel, so they're observers of the world. They see the flaws in society. They see unfairness, and it pains them so much, or it angers them so much, that they have to put it down on paper. They have to put it out there into the world and express themselves. And you know, I think that that's what all, you know, I tried to choose women in this book, and it was very difficult because
Imagine.
there were so many, you know, obviously so many. And you know, I have many essays written in my computer files that will never see the light of day because I ran out of space, I ran out of time, and I had an illustrator drawing all these beautiful 4-color illustrations, and she did 65 of them, which is a tremendous amount of work for an illustrator to do, even over the course of 1 year. So I was limited, and I really wanted to make sure that each woman was a ground, like broke new ground in some way, that whatever, like through her life, through her work, she was doing something, bringing something to the table, um, that no one else had really done before. And clearly, you know, obviously there are like people like Afra Ben, for example, who was a famous playwright in her time and very successful, and was writing these very raunchy, I mean, I remember studying um, um, restoration plays when I was in school, and they're pretty bawdy and they're hilariously funny and they're over the top. But she was writing plays that were so successful, and the king loved them and the court loved them. And so she became the toast of the town, and she wrote as well as the men did. And they begrudged her that, you know, they did not, they were unhappy that a woman whose mind was clearly not as strong, you know, women were not considered intellectual or as intelligent. They were weak. They were weak-minded. They were not meant for intellect and ideas and writing. The fact that she was so successful really upset them. And so they did, you know, the way that they retaliated was by destroying her reputation. And in many cases, what the, women are writing about things that men are writing about, or they're writing about things that are true to their own experience as women. And yet when they're calling it out, it's like a Me Too of in its own way. When they call it out, there is outrage. How dare you share that? How dare you do it in a way that's just as good as, as we are. And it was also considered the female experience was not as valuable or as important. So it was diminished and, and pushed away. Like, so when Aphra Behn died, they destroyed her reputation in the press. They called her a harlot. They did, and her books were erased. And it really wasn't until Virginia Woolf started writing in the early 20th century, she rediscovered Aphra Behn and put her back out in the world. And then in the 1970s, during the beginning time of the feminist theory, in literature movement, she was like Alice Walker discovered, like Alice Walker found Zora Neale Hurston, who had been forgotten, who died penniless and unknown, working as a maid in a hotel. But she's written these incredible works. And there are people even like Rosario Castellanos, who gave voice to the indigenous people, particularly the women of Mexico, and was a intellectual and a professor in her time. But in the United States or in Europe, we don't necessarily know that much about her. But she did some groundbreaking work because she spoke the Mayan language, and so she could interpret. Sometimes you have to be ambassadors to the cultures that can't, for people who can't speak for themselves. And so I look at these women as very courageous in that they spoke for the women who could not speak for themselves.
There are 2 points in there I want to come back to, because that was a lot of great stuff in there. The first point is you talked about how the women like Aphra Behn were branded hysterical, or they were branded to be horrible people.
Immoral.
Immoral, that's a great word. Horrible that it's applied to women so much. But I think that we can see that how that attitude still exists today, like the way that the terms chick lit and women's fictions are often said in tones that are derogatory. Even the phrase women writers is said in a reductive manner. And that's just an echo that we've been hearing throughout all the time.
Right.
Do you think that the stigma about women writing about women's issues, like Judy Blume, who opened up this world for teenage girls and talked to them about menstruation, masturbation, having sex for the first time, all of these big issues, and she's the most banned most banned author of all time. Yes. Do you think that in even say the 40 years or so that since Judy Blume first published, that women writing about women's issues is going to be, or has been seen as more acceptable and less like a women's thing?
Well, I think it's always going to be considered a women's thing. I mean, I know that my son had to read some Judy Blume books when he was younger, but they weren't, "Are You There, God, It's Me, Margaret." It was
Lover.
It was like Tales of a Fourth Grade Nothing. Mm-hmm. And I know he's reading Pride and Prejudice right now in 10th grade, although he refuses to talk to me about it. So we'll have to get into that at some other time. The reality is, publishing has changed so much. Publishing is such a huge business and industry, and so many books are published now. And publishers know that women buy books, mm-hmm. and they want to buy books that they can relate to. And that, I think, combined with the understanding that we need more diversity in the books that are published and broader experiences on the page, published. I mean, there is a major movement in book publishing right now. I mean, we just had a big discussion about it today, of getting those voices that have not been heard and putting them out into the world. And I think in some Like I also know when my son's summer reading before going into high school, there were 4 books and they were all written by women of color. And I said, that's a school I want my son to go to.
Yeah.
Right. And it's not taking away from the classics. These are newer books, and he said to me, he was just like, oh, I can't believe I have to read these books. And when he read them, he said, they were surprisingly pretty. They were surprisingly good. And they were surprisingly really dark. There were some really bad things happening. It's like, well, there are bad things that happen, and particularly to women. And it's silence that perpetuates the problem. And so, but going back, like I remember when Bridget Jones first came out, and I mean, that book sold like crazy. Everybody was reading it. It's not necessarily literature, but that's when chick lit was, the term chick lit was dubbed. And then anything that was a borderline romantic comedy was called chick lit. Anything that was popular, that was written by a woman, was called chick lit. I think that it's evolving. I mean, I think the books that are out now are a lot edgier and honest and diverse, and like I think that's changing. And whether or not men read them, I don't know. It's not that relevant to me, but they're teaching them in school. And I think that the younger you get them, the more likely they are to grow up and be, have empathy and be in touch with their feminine side and understand that women's lives are complicated.
I think that's a great point, that the younger the kids are when they're reading books, the better off they will be. And I think that it's an important part of the education system, as well as anyone who puts a book in front of a kid, whether it's a parent, a teacher, a friend, an aunt, an uncle, grandparents, that they're giving kids books that are representative of all cultures, all genders, and all experiences, rather than saying, you're a boy, so I'm going to give you a book that has a sports thing on the cover. And
Right.
You're a girl, I'm going to give you something that has a ballerina on the cover.
Right.
Having that,
Yep.
that early age exploration of new worlds just opens up kids' experiences.
Yeah. But it's hard because boys are not as big, they're not readers in the same way. Some are, but like the tragedy of video games, they say like by the time a boy is 8, like video games come into his life and he stops reading. And it's sort of replaced reading, but there are always going to be true readers. Mm-hmm. Out there in the world. Some people are just like that. Some people come back to reading later in life.
And I think we're in a great time right now where if you don't like to sit with a physical book in your hands, you have so many options to explore a book, whether it's through audiobooks or if it's through interacting in some way, like through not through movies, but through interactive technologies that help you with that.
Right.
And the fact that the majority of stories being told, well, not majority, but there's a substantial amount of stories being told that do go on to be movies.
Yes.
That really does help.
Right.
Especially in the young adult age with those book sales.
Yeah.
So there's so many options now. And the fact that books are, especially, I keep saying especially, but young adult books there's been a trend to translate them into like graphic novels and other forms to get the kids engaged. And I think that's just a wonderful thing, that an experience that we're living in.
Yeah.
And I hope that it continues to grow and nurture kids. And
because the thing, you can't be a snob about it. You have to say, if it's getting them to read, right, then be happy about it, because it's better than them not reading. And several years ago, I published Oscar Huelos's memoir, and he wrote Mambo Kings Play Songs of Love, which many of you may know. And it was his only piece of nonfiction. And it's really, the memoir is really like the evolution of a writer. And he was very sick as a child, and he had to stay home in bed and missed school. He was like sickly, and he would read comic books. Like he would ask his mother, go to the store and get me. He said he wasn't really much of a reader, but that he read comic books day and night. And that gave him enough of a sense of storytelling that he became this incredible writer. But I mean, and I'm talking about Oscar here, but it's just another thing that Oscar taught me is not only that comic books aren't bad and that if they're encouraging kids to read, then that's a good thing. But also when he first started writing, he was trying to write what he thought people wanted to hear. And none of his books, no one was signing up his books. His teachers didn't think he was that good of a writer. Finally, one teacher said to him, Oscar, you're Cuban American. You grew up in Morningside Heights. You have this incredible, rich cultural history. Like, write about what you know, write about your own experience as a Cuban American immigrant. And it's when he wrote Mambo Kings, which is based on his own family history, that's when he became a big success. So, I think there's this sort of, I have to write what people want to hear from me. No, it's when you're honest, when you're truthful, when you write from what you're passionate about, when you write from your own experience, that's when you're going to find your voice and hit your stride. And those are the books that people are going to want to read.
I think that's a great point. I think we should pop to some of these questions we have here, because I could keep talking to you forever. We have a question. Do women enter the graphic novels and YA field at all?
Oh, yes, absolutely. Absolutely. And some of them have been very successful. There's Fun House.
Oh, yeah.
The author's name is, yes. So, I mean, that book is sold extremely well and is very, very popular. And
it's a Broadway musical.
It's a Broadway musical. But it all started out as a graphic novel about her family, right? About Fun House, not such a fun house. I know when I was at Gotham Books, I was not the editor, but we published a book. It was a graphic novel by a young woman about depression and anxiety. And, like just in the drawings, like you have the words, but just expressing what that feels like in black and white in a graphic novel, it really, it's very emotional. It makes it come alive. And I know even, I know that I think they just did Pride and Prejudice as a graphic novel. Like they're taking some of the classics and turning them into graphic novels as a way to get young readers interested in them. Maybe I should get the graphic novel of Pride and Prejudice for my son. That's note to self.
Pride and Prejudice versus zombies.
Well, there's that too, of course. Right.
There's a few, I can't come up with the name, but one of the things I like to see lately is there's a trend to show voices from people with disabilities through graphic novels, like El Defo. If you guys haven't heard of El Defo, it is an amazing story. And seeing just the way new stories that should have been told for years are finally getting to see the light of day has been exciting too. And I think in graphic novels and YA, you see a lot of that. So that's cool. Let's see.
YA is really breaking ground that the adult publishing world was not. Talking about things that were not being talked about in other books. And it's opened things up, which is great.
What was the most amazing surprise of your research?
Oh dear. There's so many things I learned honestly, I would say the thing that blew me away the most was the lack of education for women. Like I did not realize that Virginia Woolf did not have a college education, which if you read her work, you think how? That so many of these writers were self-taught, and they either had a progressively minded father who had a library and allowed them to use it, or they were extremely wealthy and part of the court, if we're talking about Middle Ages, and books were scarce. So in order to have books, you had to be a very wealthy, noble person. And even then, it didn't mean that you would be allowed to go into the library and actually read these books or learn how to read. So I think that like literacy, the lack of literacy was a big surprise for me. And the fact that women were not necessarily getting formal educations even into the 20th century. That Mary Shelley wrote Frankenstein when she was 17 years old, and she only spent 1 month at school, at formal school, which that book is a work of genius. It's like,
and the fact that her mother, who was Mary Wollstonecraft, was
right.
such a massive women's rights. She was basically
Right.
a feminist, but the fact that she had such value on the written word, and her
Yes.
daughter still didn't have that education.
That's right. And she would say she learned how, this is a little dark, but she learned to write she would take a piece of paper and like go to her mother's tombstone and like get an imprint of the lettering on it, and taught herself to read. And also that the nuns were really the first female writers in the Western world. And the way that they were allowed to get their work down on paper, all the nuns, like they were all together, and they had like this sistership where they would teach each other to read. So you go into the convent, you escape marriage when you're 13 years old to a person that you don't know, which was arranged marriage. So many of these women in the earlier times wrote about the horrors of arranged marriage. And so to become a nun was how you got out of that. But also that like, oh gosh, whose mother was it? I want to say it was like George Eliot. So someone's mother had 25 children, 25, and she was number 24. And she looked at her mother and said, oh, I'm not doing that. And so she joined the convent. And what the nuns would do to escape, because childbirth was so dangerous, right? It was so dangerous. If you didn't die in childbirth, you were either pregnant or taking care of children for your entire short life. There was no time to learn to read. There was no time to have a room of one's own and start writing about your inner feelings or issues. You had to have the freedom. You had to have the money. You had to have the emotional space, the head space, the time in order to do that. And that's still true today. In some ways, it is still a luxury to be able to write and to find the time as a woman when there are so many responsibilities that we have to do that. But I love that the nuns were sort of secret subversives in that they used divine inspiration to talk about what was in their hearts, and they were allowed to express it because it came from God as opposed to from a woman. Mm-hmm. So it's like divine inspiration is a true thing, but you can call it whatever you want, but to say what's in your heart and put it out there into the world, to all find our ways around the systems that keep us down.
Well, I just double checked, and because you were talking about the different ways that these women had to go around the normal, I want to be a writer, I'm just going to write. They had to find ways. And you mentioned that Toni Morrison was a single mother who would get up at 4 a.m. to write. And then, I forgot there was another one that I just looked at.
No, Toni Morrison is my hero. I had such difficulty reading. Her books were so confused, like they were so hard for me to read and confusing to me when I first read them. And now I go back and I'm like, it's genius.
But she was doing that. She was writing those books as a single mother of 2 kids while she was editing as a day job. Like the lengths that I love that the continuous thread throughout the book, that the lengths these women would go to do what they feel called to do and to do their passion. I can't remember the one person who it was, but like you were talking about education, there was the one girl who would listen while her father gave her brother.
Oh, that was Murasaki, Lady Murasaki. Her father was teaching her brother to read, and she would stand out the door and listen in. And that's how she learned Chinese, because Japanese women did not speak Chinese. They were not allowed to speak Chinese because it was the man's language. So she learned it. So she had a little edge there.
It's just incredible. You see, for hundreds of years, the dedication to have your voice be heard and to
Yes.
learn, not just to have
Yes.
your voice be heard, but to learn.
Yes.
And I think that I'm not going to say that women are more capable but than men, but I will say that they've been put into circumstances that have required them to work harder to get to where they want, especially in the world of writing. And
You have to be resourceful, and you have to manage your energy. Like I'm a book editor. I have 2 kids. I'm a single mom. I could not write a book. I could not write a book right now with all of my responsibilities, but I was in a position where I was freelancing and I was able to take that year and work on the book. I don't know how Toni Morrison did it, but she left Random House. Like, once she became successful as a writer, she left her editing job and started writing full time, and then started becoming a professor. So, it's like they always say, women can't have it all. Well, you can have it all, just not at the same time, right? So you have to compartmentalize and do different things at different times in your life.
yeah. All right. Anne says, thank you, Lauren, for shining a light on the achievements of women authors, the progress or lack of that we have experienced over the years. I am looking forward to reading Bookish Broads.
Well,
Before I forget, I will put in links to the book in the chat. That way you all can go buy it. There you go.
I will tell, while you do that, I'm going to just tell a quick story, and I'm sure, I think we're running out of time, but when I wrote this book proposal and my agent sent it out to book publishers, I had a book come out before that, my Dolly Parton book, which at this point has sold extremely well. Now, it took a couple years, but it's, Dolly keeps getting bigger, and the book, it's just sort of like every week it's like selling better and better, which is wonderful. But when I sent this, despite having a successful publication, when I sent this proposal around, and these are my people, publishers, these are my people, and they said, oh, another book about women's accomplishments and women empowerment. We all have feminist fatigue. And 8 publishers bid on the Dolly book, and only 2 publishers bid on this book. And I want to just prove them wrong and say, there's no such thing as feminist fatigue. Appreciating the accomplishments of women writers is a perennial interest, and aspiring writers, it's there to bring us back to their work and the challenges that they had. But if you're an aspiring writer and you read about these women and see what they went through, it will drive you, it will lift you up, it will make you realize that if they could do it, you can too. And working on this book, it was so encouraging to me. It really inspired me to write it. And I hate that even 2 years ago that the publishing industry is still saying we've seen too many books about women's accomplishments. Let's move on to the next thing. It's like, no, nope, no. It's not going away. And writing, people who want to write and express their voice on the page is never going to go away.
And we're at a point where there's so many ways for people to do that.
That's right.
And that's an exciting moment, that the voices that 20 years ago would not have been able to be heard now can either self-publish, or they can do a blog, or a podcast. And it's great to hear all the different stories. And thank you so much for highlighting so many that you have. You've done 3 books that feature women, and we're excited to see what you do next. I do have a question, 2 more questions, if you're okay with that.
3. Yeah, I'm fine.
Okay. Do you think Harry Potter would have been as successful if the hero was female?
Oh gosh, I don't know.
Hermione Potter. Hmm.
Right. Hermione. I don't know. Maybe if it was published today. I mean, that was groundbreaking in a way, because at that time, children's publishing and young adult publishing was not as powerful and strong and selling. People are always going to follow the publishers are going to follow the money, and they're going to follow what's selling and what's trendy. So I don't know. I can't really answer that. I don't know. Maybe I
But
don't
an
want to say
interesting
no.
thing is the one I didn't get back to earlier was you mentioned how um like Alice Walker rediscovered Zora Neale Hurston, and um Virginia Woolf rediscovered Afraben. There's also a trend that if you look at all of the women writers before, we would not be where we are now without those women writers. So you wouldn't have J.K. Rowling in any format if you didn't already have Ursula Le Guin.
That's right. That's right. That's exactly right. Like Ursula K. Le Guin. I mean, she's again amazing, groundbreaking. Brought like a world builder, writing about fantasy at a time when women were not doing that. Octavia Butler and Ursula K. Le Guin are just, they changed the whole genre, and Ursula's read by men and women, and yes, she paved the way for J.K. Rowling. And that's true. Like Virginia Woolf paved the way for so many other writers. Margaret Atwood.
Consciousness was not a thing, and now
That's
like
right.
even TV shows, all of like the narration and stuff is mostly stream of consciousness.
That's right. So, and inner life, acknowledging that people have an inner life. Wasn't being written about before. So, going back to your very first question about why read these books from 100 years ago, well, because all of the women writers today are standing on the shoulders of the women writers that came before them, and the techniques and the craft and the themes and the history was all, it's building, like they are building on what has been done before.
So it'll be interesting to see, because there was a J.K. Rowling,
Yes.
how maybe we will have a female wizard that takes over the world in 30 years, maybe, maybe all wizards will be women. We don't know.
Who's going to write it, right?
Yeah.
That's what Octavia Butler did with science fiction. She brought women in as the main characters, the protagonists and the heroes, the heroines. So,
and Ursula K. Le Guin went even further, and she had a book that didn't even have gender.
You could choose your gender once a month or something, and so that's what the imagination can do. Create alternative worlds where you're reflecting the flaws of society and commenting on them, but also envisioning a better way.
Well, I mean, Margaret Atwood, with all of the dystopian, she was revolutionary. And
but she also said that she never wrote about anything that hadn't actually already happened. So you can call it's dystopian. You cannot call it fantasy, because it is all based on things that have happened historically.
Yeah.
I mean, it's fiction, and it's a story that she created out of her imagination, but the context of it, the things that are happening, have actually happened.
I love books. Benita asks, do you think women get their inspiration differently from men, and how does that impact their writing?
Well, I think it depends. I think you get inspired based on what's going on in your own mind and imagination. Like I'm with fiction, or not, like nonfiction. For me, I've written about women that inspire me at that time in my life. Like there are different times in your life where you need different things, or you're paying attention to different things, and or you're transitioning through one period of your life into the next, and it's through, like, to me, it's like when you learn a new word, then you start seeing that word everywhere, right? So to me, it's like if I have an idea that's in my head, then I just start seeing that idea reflected everywhere. And to me, that's how ideas come together. it's like you're thinking about it in your own mind. I can't speak to how men think versus how women think. And I don't, I think everyone thinks in their own way. And, whatever you are focusing on in your inner life is going to, you're going to start finding evidence of it all around you. And then you're going to feel compelled to put it on the page. That's how I look at it.
That makes sense. Kathleen says, not a question, but rather a comment. So enjoyed this segment and just loved and so appreciate your talent.
Oh, that's so sweet. Thank you.
And Susan says, thank you very much. Very informative and inspirational. I'm 75 and just started writing. Go for it, Susan.
That is awesome.
Go for it, Susan.
Yep. That's great. No, I mean, I'm just starting too, I'm just starting too. So
that's the beautiful thing about a piece of paper and a pen. You can find them whenever.
That's right. You can never be bored. You can never be bored. Not with a notebook and a pen, you can never be bored.
Well, thank you so much, Lauren. This has been wonderful.
Thank you. I really enjoyed it. So nice to talk to you. And I can't see who's out there, but thank you for coming. I hope you enjoyed it. I hope you learned something. I hope you feel inspired to write or to read some of these women or delve in and see what they were all about.
I'm going to quickly pop up a slide here that has the cover of your book, so everyone can see it. And once again, I did put the links in the chat, so go forth and buy.
Prove them all wrong. It's not feminist fatigue.
And then if you want to contact Lauren, here is her information. You can get a lot of information on her website. Some of the resources that she used in researching the books, the book are on the website. So it's a really great reading list. So I encourage you all to.
There's 400 sources, and I had to hire someone to go through all my messy notes and put that together for me. But the sources are all there. So if there's a particular author you really like, you can go find sort of the definitive biography of them or articles by them. Yeah.
So go do that. And then just a little bit, we thank you for attending. If you haven't attended any of our events before, we hope that you'll come back again. If you're not familiar with our organization, we're 103 years old, and we were founded by a group of women booksellers who were not allowed to join the all-male booksellers associations. So a few days after the big suffrage march in New York, they got together, and here we are today, still talking and sharing about books. So you can visit our website, and then we do have more events coming up for Women's History Month, and we hope that you'll attend, and you can grab that link on our website. So thank you so much. And thank you again, Lauren. This has been fantastic.
Bye-bye.
Bye.